Last week, with our discussion of the Restoration and John Dryden, I asked you guys to read Dryden's essay on satire, right? And part of that topic was on satire, and he says that the good satire is only good if it uses wit, and it's witty. So the kind of concept of the Spectator number 62, they're writing about wit and what makes it valuable and what makes it appropriate. And I think that this is something that's really kind of important for our purposes, is because so much of what happens in so much of what is written in the 18th century, and most of what we are going to be reading from this point forward, is considered satire. And part of this kind of conversation of what makes something valuable, what makes this literature good literature, um, relies on this concept of wit. And prior to the 18th century, wit meant to know, right? To have the mental ability, to be learned, intellectual, or clever. And we saw that with the writings of someone like John Donne, when he used his wit to make these kind of complicated metaphorical conceits when he compared the flea to sexual intercourse or marriage, right? However, what happens during the 18th century is we have this good kind of this wit debate, and wit kind of evolves into what makes this question of what makes good writing and what makes someone smart or clever. And I think it's interesting to note this importance of definition, because, I mean, if you think about what's being written at the time, the first dictionary is written. And when we have a definition of a word, right, we have a kind of general consensus, something that is empirical, based on observation, and something that is kind of grounded in what we would consider quote unquote truth, right? So it goes back to all of these ideas that we've been talking about, particularly with John Locke. So this whole, the Spectator number 62, it gives us a definition of wit. It gives us a sense of objectivity. And part of what he says, part of what Addison says that makes wit significant is that it's not obvious, right? And so if we look at his definition, he builds on Locke's kind of ideas of what makes something truth, right? He observes that judgment and wit are not the same thing. So for him, what makes something witty is it is quickness, it has variety, it is congruent, right? It is, there are these agreeable visions in fancy, right? It's imaginative, in other words. It's entertaining, and it's universal in that it can be understood. And that is Locke's definition of wit. And while Addison is okay with Locke's definition, I mean, he even says that he has an admirable reflection upon the difference of wit and judgment, right? He thinks that this is okay. However, he says that there's only one problem with this definition, and he feels that he needs to add this kind of addition. So Addison says that the resemblance of ideas, such as metaphors, similes, allusions, comparisons. The problem is that Locke only requires that they be logical or appropriate, right? For Addison, though, wit, in order for it to be wit, right, is that it must delight and surprise the reader. It should be unpredictable. It should be lighthearted. It should be unexpected. And in order to kind of clarify this idea, he gives this example. He says, to represent the whiteness of an object by that of milk and snow, or the variety of and the variety of its colors by those of the rainbow, cannot be called wit. Uh, Besides the obvious resemblance, uh, there must be uh, there must be some further congruity discovered in the two ideas that is capable of giving the reader some surprise. So comparing or saying that something is white as snow, like a mistress's bosom, is obvious, right? That's not witty, right? Um, he says, thus, when a poet tells us the bosom of his mistress is as white as snow, there is no wit in the comparison. But when he adds, with a sigh, that it's as cold too, it then grows into wit. So when he's saying that the bosom, like snow, is also cold, it means that he's kind of poking fun of and saying something. I don't know if it's self-deprecating or whatever, but and maybe not self-deprecating, but there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek way of saying, her bosom, which should be warm, right? Like a bosom should be warm and welcoming. Like let me press my child up to my bosom so it can feel my love or whatever, right? That should be right, a warm and welcoming place. But the irony is he's saying that it's cold. So when you think about Addison and his definition of wit. He said, I think the best way of saying is that what makes something kind of witty is there has to be some sort of irony in it. So um, he goes on through this kind of interesting conversation of there being a true wit, which is the wit we just discussed, the one that is surprising, the one that is showing something kind of delightful and unexpected. And he goes in to talk about false wits, and he says that false wit only have congruencies of letters. Instead of having the congruency of ideas, they only have this kind of fascination or the ability to play with alliteration, the way things are worded, or rhyme scheme. Uh, like anagrams, puns, things like that. And then he goes on. I mean, there's not that kind of elevated thinking that goes into being a true wit. And he goes on to further say that a mixed wit is one who mixes words and ideas. And that for him seems to be the best kind of wit, one that has these kind of elevated, surprising thoughts, but also it's kind of a word play, or it sounds good too, right? So the mixed wit is his preferred wit. That's the kind of wit that he thinks is the better of the three. And to give that kind of example, he talks a lot about all of these different true wits and false wits, but he gives this example of um, this author named Cowley, and he is talking about the passion of love. Its nature has been thought to resemble fire, for which reasons the words fire and flame are made use of to signify love. The witty poets, therefore, have taken an advantage from this doubtful meaning of the word fire to make an infinite number of witticisms. And he goes on to talk about the difference between hot and cold. And this author named Cowley, he says when he says, what does he say? Cowley, observing the cold regard of his mistress's eyes, and at the same time their power of producing love in him, considers them as burning glasses made of ice, and finding himself able to live in the greatest extremities of love, concludes the torrid zone to be habitable, right? Um, when his mistress has read the letter written in juice of lemon by holding it to the fire, her desire he desires her to read it over a second time by love's flame. When she weeps, he wishes it were inward heat that distilled those drops from the Limebeck. When she is absent, he is beyond 80, that is 30 degrees nearer the pole than when she is with him. And I think like what he's saying, the interesting thing that he's saying is that um, this is meant to be humorous in a way because he's saying, um, I want the fire to melt the coldness of her heart because I love her so much, right? Or it's kind of this play on this concept of fire and ice, where if something is cold for so long, it's burning hot, right? So I think that there's that kind of irony in that sounds good as well as uh, the thought is good behind it. So that's what he says is makes a good wit. So one who mixes ideas and words, and the words have to sound good, and the ideas have to surprise and delight. And I think that if we want to think about the compared to someone like Dryden, where it's kind of sort of similar, I think maybe in a way where wit, what makes good wit or good satire is this insult without injury. So um, the kind of final thoughts that kind of Addison comes up with in the Spectator 62. Wit provokes both thought and laughter and delight, and it's a kind of clever expression. So that is, in a nutshell, the Spectator number 62. So I'm interested to see what you guys think, and especially as we move forward into our conversation of satire in the next few weeks. So until then.